General Hospital spoilers tease that the confirmation of Natalia Ramirez's autopsy report sent shockwaves through Port Charles that no one was prepared to absorb. After weeks of suspicion, silence, and whispered theories, the forensic evidence laid out an inescapable truth. Her death was no accident, and the person now officially named as responsible was none other than Sonny Corinthos. The man who had stood at the center of the town's underworld for decades, shielded by power, influence, and fear, was now facing a reckoning that threatened to dismantle everything he had built. For many, it was the moment they never believed would come. For others, it was the beginning of a terrifying new chapter where nothing would ever be the same. The medical examiner's findings were disturbingly precise. Traces of a synthetic compound were discovered in Natalia's bloodstream. One that was not consistent with her known prescriptions or prior medical records. The substance, when mixed with alcohol and her existing antidepressants, created a lethal cocktail that guaranteed a swift and irreversible outcome. What made the discovery even more chilling was that the compound had no commercially available form. It had to have been acquired through illicit means. Authorities confirmed the timeline matched the final evening Natalia spent alone in her apartment after her last conversation with Sonny. A conversation that surveillance audio had partially captured through a traffic cam feed outside her building. In that recording, Natalia could be heard insisting she trusted Sonny, and that he had promised her a new life in Belize, free from persecution and pain. But what came next was the rupture. A secondary forensic analysis identified a partial fingerprint on the exterior of a glass bottle recovered from her residence, a bottle later determined to contain residue of the lethal substance. That partial print matched Sonny's. The Department of Justice, under mounting political pressure and a climate of growing discontent with corruption in Port Charles, moved swiftly. They labeled the death suspicious homicide, and for the first time, Sonny Corinthos was publicly named in connection with an open murder case. The PCPD issued a sealed indictment, and Anna Devane, despite her long history with Sonny, was forced to act within the bounds of the law. When she, Laura Collins, and Sonny were seen exiting the interrogation room at PCPD, the tension was thick, almost suffocating. Anna's face bore the weight of betrayal, law, and moral uncertainty. Laura, as always, played the diplomat, but even she couldn't conceal her shaken demeanor. Sonny, usually composed, looked hollow, not afraid, but as if absorbing the truth of something far more sinister than anyone knew. As the news broke, the city reacted like a body suddenly exposed to trauma. The Corinthos organization went silent, a rare occurrence that only confirmed to outsiders that something serious had ruptured. Longtime allies began distancing themselves. Jordan Ashford quietly recused herself from any involvement in the case, citing personal conflicts of interest. Carly, upon hearing the news, refused to believe it. She stormed into the DA's office demanding proof, but when shown the evidence, photos, reports, voice analysis, and the partial print, her knees buckled. For the first time, even she couldn't deny what the facts presented. Meanwhile, Marco Rios, Natalia's son, had transformed from a grieving son into a determined avenger. For days he had warned anyone who would listen that Sonny couldn't be trusted, that his mother had died not because of a relapse but because she had crossed a line Sonny wouldn't tolerate. But until now, he had no ammunition. Now, he had the full force of the law behind his accusations. And Marco, guided by the fury of a man who had lost everything, vowed that Sonny would not escape justice, not this time. At a press conference, Marco appeared publicly alongside Jen Sidwell, the powerful financier who had long harbored resentment against Sonny. Sidwell had his own motivations, of course, but he played the grieving ex-lover well, using Natalia's death as a stepping stone to launch an all-out war on Sonny's empire. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It had become a power struggle. The autopsy results marked a dramatic turning point not only in the investigation but in the entire social architecture of Port Charles. Suddenly, those who had once protected Sonny, those who owed him loyalty, money, or favors, began re-evaluating their positions. Curtis Ashford distanced himself from the Corinthos name in his legitimate business ventures. Nina, whose entanglement with Sonny had already frayed at the seams, refused to return his calls. Unsure whether she had loved a savior or a murderer. Even Dex, Sonny's once fiercely loyal enforcer, went dark, sending no signals of support. The walls weren't just closing in. They were caving in all at once. Public opinion divided in stark lines. Some still believed Sonny was innocent, claiming he was framed, that someone had tampered with evidence to finally bring down the city's most elusive outlaw. Others believed it was about time justice caught up with him. Whispers in the corridors of General Hospital, at Charlie's pub, and inside the Metro Court turned into open conversations. People who had once feared speaking Sonny's name now spat it with venom or shook their heads in disbelief. And still, one question refused to go away: if Sonny really didn't do it, then who did? The theory that Sonny had been framed gained traction. Ezra Boyle, the cunning and well-connected city council member, had been quietly investigating Sonny's dealings under the pretense of fiscal reform. Some now wondered if Boyle had orchestrated the perfect storm, leveraging Natalia's vulnerability, manipulating the chain of custody on the forensic evidence, and exploiting Sidwell's grief to wage political warfare. Others suspected ADA Justine Turner, the same woman who had pressured Natalia to turn on Sonny, might have played a more sinister role than anyone realized. If she believed taking down Sonny would advance her career, perhaps she found a way to ensure the outcome she needed. But no matter who was behind the curtain, the result was the same: Sonny Corinthos was unraveling. Behind the scenes, Jason Morgan, long thought dead, had quietly returned to town under an alias. He had been investigating the situation from afar, trying to determine whether his oldest friend had truly become the monster everyone now claimed he was. But what he uncovered only deepened the mystery. Security footage from the apartment building where Natalia died had a 3-hour gap. Records at the medical examiner's office showed a technician who had never been employed there before, listed on the day Natalia's toxicology samples were processed. It was a ghost, a planted identity. Jason now believed someone had rewritten the narrative, forged the evidence, and was manipulating public sentiment to bring Sonny down. But the clock was ticking. Once a man is accused of killing a woman, especially a woman as vulnerable and tragic as Natalia, the stain rarely washes away, no matter what truth comes to light later. With the trial looming and the city fracturing under the weight of secrets, Sonny stood on the precipice of total collapse. The autopsy report had triggered a domino effect that no one could stop. Whether he was truly guilty or being used as a scapegoat in a grander scheme, the consequences were the same: alliances were broken, reputations shattered, and power permanently shifted. Natalia's death had not only ended a life, it had rewritten the rules of Port Charles. And Sonny Corinthos, the man who once controlled every outcome, now faced the most uncertain future of all. The truth behind Natalia's death was far darker than anyone in Port Charles had imagined. While the city reeled from the explosive revelation that Sonny Corinthos had been officially named responsible, a deeper, more insidious truth was beginning to surface, a truth that pointed directly to Jen Sidwell. Behind the curtain of grief and public outrage, Sidwell had orchestrated one of the most calculated and malicious frame jobs the city had ever seen. From the moment Natalia reconnected with Sonny, Sidwell had been watching, waiting, calculating every step to destroy the man he blamed for everything, including his own loss of control over Natalia. The plan had formed with terrifying speed, born from Sidwell's obsession and hunger for vengeance. Knowing Natalia's vulnerabilities, her addiction history, her emotional confusion about Sonny's promises, Sidwell saw the perfect opportunity to manipulate not just her, but the perception of everyone around her. He weaponized her heartbreak, her relapse, and ultimately her death. While pretending to grieve, Sidwell was laying the groundwork for Sonny's downfall with a precision that was both methodical and sadistic. It was Sidwell who introduced the foreign compound into Natalia's system, a substance undetectable by standard toxicology tests unless specifically searched for. It was Sidwell who altered the security footage, created the ghost technician at the examiner's office, and ensured the glass with Sonny's partial print was strategically placed. Every detail had been engineered to point back to Sonny, feeding on his past sins, his criminal history, and his reputation as a man who destroyed what he could not control. The trap was airtight. The story airtight, except for one truth that now hovered dangerously close to the surface: Sonny hadn't done it. This marked the beginning of a dangerous new reality. A horrifying shift in the balance of power that was unlike anything Port Charles had faced before. Sidwell wasn't just acting out of revenge, he was reshaping the city through fear, manipulation, and destruction. This wasn't merely about Sonny's fall, it was about taking everything Sonny had ever touched and turning it into ash. The obsession was complete. And it was growing more unhinged by the day. Sonny, once the predator, was now the prey in a hunt where the rules had changed overnight. What once would have been a whisper of conspiracy now became a storm of paranoia. Every room Sonny entered felt colder, every eye more accusatory. His allies hesitated. His enemies circled like vultures. The psychological warfare Sidwell had unleashed was relentless. Rumors spread that Sonny was unraveling, and he was. Because what made Sidwell's plan so devastating wasn't just the false evidence or the planted motive. It was that he had taken Sonny's greatest strength, his control, and turned it into a weapon against him. What haunted Sonny most wasn't the looming trial or the whispers in the streets, it was the realization that someone had gotten inside his world without leaving a single trace. Sidwell had studied him, understood him, and anticipated every move. The level of detail, the psychological torment, the speed of the collapse, it all pointed to an enemy who wasn't acting on impulse but on obsession. This was more than revenge. It was a vendetta designed to break Sonny not just legally, but spiritually. The city, once ruled by fear of Sonny, was now gripped by a new kind of terror, the knowledge that if a man like Sidwell could orchestrate such chaos and destruction undetected, no one was truly safe. This was no longer about criminal empires or territory. This was about the anatomy of obsession, the creation of a new kind of power, one that fed on paranoia, spectacle, and irreversible damage. And Sonny, for the first time in decades, had no roadmap, no leverage, and no certainty. As this new era of madness unfolded, the lines between reality and deception blurred. Sidwell's plan wasn't just effective, it was terrifyingly seamless. And with every day that passed, the danger around Sonny multiplied. The threats weren't just coming from the courts or the press, they were now embedded within his own mind. The paranoia, the isolation, the fear that everyone could be bought or broken, they were eating him alive from the inside out. Sidwell had created not just a trap, but a psychological prison. And as Sonny stood at the center of it, surrounded by shadows, suspicion, and betrayal, he realized this wasn't just a war for his freedom. It was a war for his sanity. And it had only just begun. Sidwell had always played the long game. His mind was a fortress of calculation, devoid of empathy, and driven by the singular belief that the end always justified the means. So when the autopsy results on Natalia Ramirez came back and pointed fingers at Sonny Corinthos, it wasn't simply a turn of fate, it was a meticulously crafted chapter in a much larger plan. One that had been set in motion long before Natalia ever reached for that final drink. But as Sonny's name became irrevocably tied to murder in the court of public opinion, Sidwell knew the victory wasn't complete. Not yet. For a man like Sonny, incarceration wasn't enough. Life behind bars meant access, leverage, communication, it meant survival. And survival wasn't what Sidwell was after. He wanted erasure. He wanted death. Quiet, untraceable, and permanent. With the forensic evidence doctored, witness narrative seeded, and public outrage carefully inflamed, the only step remaining was to ensure the judicial system responded exactly as intended. This wasn't the first time Sidwell had corrupted a courtroom. And it wouldn't be the last. He already had ties to a sitting judge with a hidden portfolio, debts in overseas accounts, connections to offshore businesses tied to Sidwell's holdings, and a long history of decisions that could collapse under even a shallow investigation. The judge, once presented with evidence that could destroy his career and freedom, understood the assignment without a single word being spoken. In return for silence and continued protection, He would see to it that Sonny Corinthos received the harshest sentence allowable under law, life imprisonment with no possibility of parole. No plea deals. No negotiations. Just the long, slow rot of a man caged and forgotten. But Sidwell had no intention of letting Sonny live long enough to appeal the sentence. The moment Sonny would be remanded into the custody of the state, Phase 2 would begin, a covert operation masquerading as fate. Sidwell had already arranged the placement of a violent inmate in the same block as Sonny. A man with nothing to lose and every incentive to follow instructions, the promise of protection for his family on the outside, and a hefty sum deposited into an untraceable account. The plan was simple: provoke a fight, make it look spontaneous, then let the chaos unfold while prison guards, already bribed or intimidated into complicity, delayed their response. There would be no camera angles. No usable footage. No reliable witnesses. Just a scuffle that turned fatal, a sharpened piece of metal. And a story about prison violence claiming another high-profile inmate. To the public, it would be a tragic yet unsurprising end for a career criminal. To the court system, it would be one less case to manage. But to Sidwell, it would be the final note in a symphony of destruction he had composed piece by piece. He wouldn't simply defeat Sonny, he would erase him. And not just from the streets, but from the history of Port Charles itself. With Sonny gone, his empire would fracture. There would be no central authority to rally behind. No godfather to settle disputes, and no legacy to honor. Loyalists would turn on one another. The organization, once a fortress of silence and loyalty, would become a battlefield of ambition and betrayal. And in the middle of that chaos, Sidwell would emerge untouched, smiling from the shadows. He knew Sonny's influence extended beyond bullets and bribes. It was psychological, a mythology built on reputation, fear, and presence. The only way to destroy that was to not just kill the man, but to break the myth. And there was no more humiliating death for a man like Sonny than a silent, unheroic end in a jail cell, killed not by an enemy on the street, but by a nameless prisoner who would disappear as quickly as he had been planted. The symbolic weight of it was everything Sidwell craved, to see Sonny's power reduced to a prison obituary. To watch Carly grieve a man who was framed by someone she never suspected, to see Michael, Dante, and Christina ask themselves if they could have prevented it, and to see the town, for once, move forward without Sonny at the center of it. But the madness didn't end there. Because in Sidwell's mind, this wasn't simply vengeance, it was purification. Natalia's death was not collateral. It was the sacrifice that allowed his plan to be righteous in his twisted logic. To him, she was a necessary instrument, the first domino. The fact that she had once loved Sonny, the fact that she had trusted him, only made her more perfect in her role. She was the bait, the tragedy, the spark that lit the city's demand for justice. And once that spark became a wildfire, Sidwell stood calmly with the gasoline, watching it all burn. As the date of the sentencing hearing approached, Sonny's defenses were crumbling. His legal team had been shaken. Witnesses had vanished. A key forensic expert died in a freak car accident. Every person who tried to support Sonny seemed to meet misfortune or intimidation. Jason, working quietly from the outside, had begun to piece together the conspiracy, but every move he made was met with another wall: false leads, missing files, corrupted systems. It was as though Sidwell had not only infiltrated the legal system but rewired the entire city to work against anyone trying to expose him. And then came the whispers from inside Pentonville. Rumors of a new inmate being moved to Sonny's block. Unexplained changes in guard rotations. Strange delays in medical responses. All signs that the trap was nearly complete. Sonny, sensing the shift, became increasingly paranoid. He knew he had enemies in prison, but this felt orchestrated, like death was stalking him through the concrete halls. Yet no one on the outside could stop it. Not yet. Not while Sidwell still controlled the narrative, the evidence, the judge, and now, the prison itself. What remained was a race against time. Could anyone uncover the truth before the final blow was struck? Could Jason, or Carly, or even Dante piece together enough evidence to expose Sidwell's plot before Sonny became another inmate killed in a random prison fight? Or would Sidwell succeed in orchestrating the perfect crime, framing a man for murder, securing a life sentence, and then eliminating him without ever lifting a weapon? The clock was ticking. And the air in Port Charles grew heavier with every passing hour. Because if Sidwell could do this to Sonny Corinthos, the most powerful man in the city, then no one was safe. And if the truth didn't come out soon, Port Charles wouldn't just lose Sonny, it would lose its soul. Michael was beginning to unravel. Everything he had built. Everything he had fought for, his children, his family's legacy, his sense of moral superiority, was crumbling beneath the weight of forces far beyond his control. What had once been a carefully orchestrated battle for custody of Wiley and Amelia had turned into a psychological and political nightmare, all manipulated from behind the scenes by one man. Jen Sidwell. Michael had suspected interference, but he had underestimated the scale and precision of Sidwell's influence. And now, with the judge's ruling looming and the balance of power tipping swiftly against him, the devastating truth became undeniable. Sidwell had bribed the presiding judge, ensuring Michael's total and public collapse. The moment the realization struck, Michael felt a kind of helplessness he had never known. This wasn't just a personal loss. It was an orchestrated humiliation. A man like Sidwell didn't just want to win, he wanted to ruin his opponents, to psychologically dismantle them until nothing remained but self-doubt and wreckage. For Michael, the custody battle had always been about protecting his children, shielding them from chaos, from criminal influence, from the destructive legacies of Sonny and Nina. But now, his worst fears had come true. Not only was he losing them, but they were being handed over to forces even darker than he had imagined. The judge, once thought impartial, had issued a series of pretrial rulings that seemed increasingly lopsided. Motions in Michael's favor were denied without justification. Testimonies that should have been admissible were dismissed as hearsay. Expert witnesses were discredited for minor clerical inconsistencies. And through it all, Sidwell remained disturbingly quiet. His silence more threatening than any open attack. It was clear that the courtroom had been compromised, that justice was no longer the objective, but rather the illusion. And Michael, once so confident, was now trapped in a game he couldn't win, a game whose rules changed every time he thought he understood them. This was not simply a legal battle anymore, it had become a full-blown psychological siege. Michael couldn't sleep. He couldn't eat. Every time he looked at Wiley and Amelia, the dread became unbearable. He imagined them growing up under the shadow of those who had manipulated the system to take them. He imagined the day they would ask him why he didn't fight harder. Why he didn't stop it. And the truth, that he had fought with everything he had, only to be crushed by a rigged system, offered no comfort. Worse still, Michael found himself haunted by questions he couldn't answer. How deep did Sidwell's network go? How long had this plan been in motion? Had every hearing, every meeting, every legal maneuver already been predicted and outplayed? The paranoia was suffocating. Friends began to withdraw, unsure of how to help him. Even those closest to him, Carly, Willow, Jason, could see the torment consuming him, but none could reach him in the depths of his obsession. Because for Michael, this wasn't just about losing custody. It was about being rendered powerless in the one arena he had always believed was sacred, protecting his children. The obsession grew, tightening around his mind like a vice. Every day brought new developments, new betrayals, new evidence of just how thoroughly Sidwell had dismantled his reality. Court documents were leaked to the press, painting Michael as emotionally unstable, vindictive, and dangerous. Character witnesses who had once praised him now seemed distant, uncertain, as if rehearsing a script they hadn't written. Even Wiley's teacher, someone Michael trusted implicitly, had submitted a revised affidavit that seemed oddly curated to support joint custody, not full placement with Michael. The weight of it all began to manifest in dangerous ways. Michael lashed out in private, pacing obsessively, reading and rereading legal briefs until the words lost meaning. He no longer trusted his lawyers, believing that some of them may have been bought. He reviewed security footage from his own home, convinced that bugs had been planted. He began to question every phone call, every text message, every casual glance from someone in the courtroom. Sidwell had turned his life into a labyrinth of suspicion, and there was no exit in sight. And then came the worst blow of all, the court's preliminary ruling. Though temporary, it granted Sidwell's chosen guardian emergency joint custody of Wiley and Amelia pending the final hearing. The justification was vague, citing emotional volatility and concerns about the child's emotional environment. But Michael knew what it really meant. The judge had delivered the first dagger. And the final ruling would be the death sentence. The shockwave was immediate and devastating. Michael collapsed in his office, staring blankly at the court order. The reality hit him like a freight train. The system hadn't just failed him, it had betrayed him. And Sidwell had orchestrated every step with clinical precision. Now, Michael was consumed by a haunting realization. This was no longer just a custody dispute or a personal vendetta. This was a war against something far bigger, far more corrupt. Sidwell wasn't just targeting Sonny or seeking revenge for Natalia, he was restructuring the power dynamics of Port Charles, using institutions like the family court as weapons. Michael's downfall was just one casualty in a much larger scheme. The city had become a chessboard, and Michael, once a king in his own right, had been reduced to a broken pawn, used, discarded, and humiliated. In the quiet hours of the night, Michael sat alone in his empty home, the silence thick with fear. The echo of his children's laughter had faded, replaced by legal jargon, whispered threats, and unspoken shame. The obsession had taken root, growing like a cancer. And with it came a terrifying awareness: this wasn't over. Sidwell might have won this round, but Michael, broken as he was, still had one weapon left: rage. And though he had lost faith in the courts, in the system, in fairness itself, he hadn't lost faith in his ability to destroy everything Sidwell had built, by any means necessary. But for now, all he could do was watch, helpless, as his children slipped further away. Stolen not by law, but by manipulation, power, and a madness that was tightening its grip around Port Charles. And the most terrifying part? No one knew who would be next.